20 slides, that's it. 20 seconds a slide, and it's going to move automatically, so no control. That's part of the fun of it. Our first up, Michael Malone, AIA, is a founding principal of Michael Malone Architects, an architecture firm based in Dallas, Texas. He's a frequent contributor to a variety of professional journals and is a contributing writer for Texas Architect Magazine, which is the best state architecture magazine in the country. One of the best architecture magazines in the country. He's also the author of The Architect's Guide to Residential Design, published in 2010 by McGraw-Hill. He's active, very active, in the Texas Society of Architects. He's the current chairman of the Publications Committee and former chairman of the Texas Society of Architects Design Committee. He initiated and chaired the first Texas Society of Architects Design Conference in 2011, and he does really good work, and we're really delighted to have him. Michael, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Yes.
He's the tallest architect in Texas.
Okay, I think if this all works right, I'm going to advance it, and then we're off to no, but now we're on Michael Malone.
And go.
Some of you may remember this book. It came out when I was in college, 1972, 5 architects. These guys went on to have some pretty good careers, so you can look them up on Google. One of the interesting things about this book was the essay by Kenneth Frampton, which was my favorite part of the book, but maybe apostate, but he had an essay called Frontality versus Rotation. The idea in frontality and rotation is that we design buildings on two-dimensional media, at least we did when I was a boy, and but we experienced them in 3 dimensions, in rotation. So Corbusier, who was a great painter, worked out a lot of his massing and theoretical ideas in paintings, which he did all through his life. The focus of the paintings is often organic objects contrasted with fixed objects, a grid. They always have a center. But the one thing that shows up over and over in all of Corbusier's paintings are bottles, these bottles, which were very sexy to him, obvious phallic references, but also the fact that they were a machine-made item that had formerly been a handmade item. So those bottles showed up, and they show up a lot in different versions. Of course, there were other things too. This sort of curving open book that you see here. But the idea was you had a framework for organic objects to happen against a rigid background. The idea that you could have frontality and rotation occurring simultaneously in the same place. Corbusier did this in his paintings, he did this in his buildings. But what they did with the 5 Architects book was, it was a focus of drawings, strong emphasis on graphism, that showed things in 2 dimensions. Now the interesting thing about frontality is, those of us who think about architecture as a movement through space, Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of pinwheeling of things, we have a hard time rectifying the idea that you can take a 2-dimensional object and turn it into a 3-dimensional thing. Painters don't have a hard time with it. Gerald Murphy here, where the only 3-dimensional object in the painting is the box label from the cigars, which was a 2-dimensional object, kind of a double entendre there. Murphy used the same kind of vocabulary and created things, and he was able to have a great deal of richness, the same kinds of things that were popular. Giorgio Morandi, starting with a tabula rosa, could take the same simple objects, put them together in space, think about how the light fell across them, and start to suggest ideas about how massing could work and how a framework could work, and how we could exist in a space looking at them. These are different from Corbusier's paintings because they're much more little, they're much more clear. Sometimes, if you think about all those objects sort of stuck together, you can start to envision a city, or the relationships of a group of people standing together in a room. All of you standing over there kind of look a lot like these bottles all arranged on this table together. So you can start to see that simple objects, again, frontal models, can start to represent greater things, that whole idea of things. Now William Bailey, the other side of that sort of still life world, he painted completely opaque objects, direct frontality, but you know they're 3-dimensional. And part of the magic here, much like an outside of a building, is that what was inside of it was as important as the massing and the modeling of the pieces together. In Morandi, you never cared about that, but in Bailey, you do. You're really interested in knowing what's inside the pieces. So in a way, this is much more architectural. Again, it's a frontal representation, but there's definitely a rotation about it. Bailey painted the same things over and over, just like Morandi. So if you look his entire over, every single painting, you'll see these bowls and these cups and these objects appear over and over. Now, the largely recently discredited Michael Graves, who was important when I was in college, a lot of the massing for his buildings, like this little spec house, are similar to those Morandi paintings we were looking at. They're objects stuck together, forming some kind of an interesting relationship, an interesting play with each other, and trying hard to find a relationship that lets that geometry work. In 3 dimensions, they're much more dynamic. They start to look like the forms that we were talking about to begin with. They start to look like bottles. They start to look like cups. They're not. They're platonic solids, penetrated. But if you don't want to talk about these things being done by somebody like Graves, he wasn't the only person who ever did this. There are other architects throughout history who have tried to collectively mass things together and find beauty and find a way for the spaces to work together. In big buildings, like Denver Public Library, it's a much more different kind of building to look at on an angle than it is from the front. Again, the frontal composition is completely different than the experience of the building in 3 dimensions or orthogonally, the same way that you move through the space. We can all move on to Louis Kahn, who I think we can generally say we all respect and think is a genius. And here the forms are masked in a similar way. All monochromatic, all simply detailed, with appropriate penetrations as you would expect in a capital of a democracy, that you can see inside those objects. They're meant to be penetrated. They're meant to represent the solidity of an institution, but at the same time they're supposed to be penetrated. So both in a mental sense and a physical sense. Now, this whole game about frontality and rotation, you could say, well, what does that have to do with human life? The important thing is in life we experience it in rotation. Isn't that what you would all say? You'd all say, well, like Morandi here, we experience those things as the spaces around an object. But how many of you go and hug your children from the side? Or how many of you greet your lover with a diagonal hug? None of you do. It's all full frontal. You come on front to front and you enjoy that relationship of one-to-one. It's how we relate to one another. It's how we interact. And that's what people do. So you can see Graves having it both ways here. He has Morandi's little bottles on this table, enlarged in the corner, in a perspective of a not very successful space. But in 1977, he was co-opting this imagery because he wanted people to see it and realize that he was using it. He wanted us all to understand that he absorbed these lessons and that they had a place in his architecture. And those are the same kinds of lessons that we have in life. We want to be represented in photographs in our handsomest and most careful poses, but we want to be surrounded by people. We want to be in a room like this where everybody around us is front and center, in the center of the thing, and we're all being enjoyed. So you see Ames's picture here with his bottle, or the guitar played in a slightly different way. Again, the fully frontal representation, the centering in the box, the heart of the object. But the real way that we experience life is on the diagonal. But we have a romantic link to things that are shown in rotation. So whenever you start to think about your life as being black and white, like that book cover I started this off with, remember that it's more complicated than that. And that what's inside the wrapper is much more important than the box that it comes in. Thank you.